Well, let me give you a warm welcome on this dreary, cold night. And I think a few more are going to be coming in, so hopefully we'll have a little bigger crowd. So, let me again welcome you. Let's thank Clint, who played that lovely piano concert. For those of you that were here to enjoy it. And he will be doing that 6 to 6:30 piano concert for our next two speakers. So if you like that, come on in. He's not going to win an Emmy Award, which he has won for playing here, but we get the benefit. So let me give you a little background for those that haven't been to a Next Chapter before and tell you what we're doing. So we started in October of last year, and the goal is really to help people transition from one life chapter to the next. And there are a lot of life chapters that we've all gone through and will go through, from retirement to losing a spouse, unexpected job loss, a lot of next chapter events in our lives. So we want to provide resources for that, wonderful speakers like Dr. Kreitzer. All of our speaker tapes are on our website, and there have been some wonderful speakers, from Will Steger to Alan Hilton, for those people that know this church, Richard Leiter, super well known. So if you're interested, go check them out. They're on our website. So for resources, we have this, and we have a resource library. And some kind person just donated about 15 books that are in our section in the library. So help yourself to that. And should you ever want to contribute books that you have, just stick them in the library. We would appreciate it. So we're self-funding, so we have a free will offering, and so if you're so inclined, you can do that on your way out. If you write a check, just make it to Izetta Community Church, and in the memo line, say Next Chapter. So I really want to thank all the people that make this happen. We had a number of greeters here tonight, and so you were probably overwhelmed. But our staff does a magnificent job in supporting this program. In the back, you've got Joel Bowers and Rick Graft, who do all the AV. They do the taping, they get it up on the website, they make sure the speaker has all the tools they need. Marnie Bear is our creative person in the church. She does the website, all the handouts that you see, and she does a wonderful job. Autumn Toussaint is our engagement manager, and she helps with this as well. And Steve Weens is our pastoral liaison. I'm sure, and John Estrom and his team, the fellowship team, will have wonderful refreshments for you when we're done. So, one of the things that's been really fun through the Next Chapter experience is to meet with people and really discuss our Next Chapter issues that we've gone through and our Next Chapter phases that we've gone through. And it made me recall one of my very first ones. When I was in college, I thought, boy, do I really need to go 4 years to be successful and get a career? And then when I was looking at a magazine, the light bulb went off, and I said, I have found my way to success, and this will be something that will really, do well for me. So what I'd seen was a weight loss ad, and I said, I am the perfect before picture. I mean, I'm built for it, I've got the body for it, and so, that was going to be my goal, be a before model. And so for a couple days I was very euphoric, and then I, found out that if you're going to be the before picture, you also have to be the after picture. And I said, well, okay. So, on to the Next Chapter. So let me talk a little bit about future speakers. Next month, we have, on 5/18, we have Ross Levin. And Ross Levin is a very well-known author, speaker. He runs a wealth management company that is highly regarded. He's written books, and he writes a column for the Star Tribune on finance, which you may have seen. And he'll give a great presentation. It's called Spend Your Life Wisely. So that'll be interesting. We have Chris Thibodeau, who I met just recently, who's an incredibly fascinating person. Chris had a major successful career in sales and marketing in the pharmaceutical industry, set out to do his own consulting in the late 40s, and that's very successful. One of his clients is the NFL, and he has a lot of other major clients. And then his dad came to him and said, Chris, you need to take over the family business. And Chris was, I just started my thing. And so he prayed about it, and he did take over the family business. So he is now the senior pastor of a large African-American church in North Minneapolis. So he'll be here. His topic is Manage Your Life Fitness, and that's going to be really interesting. So there are handouts on the way out that give you the specifics on those two things. And so let me get to introducing our speaker. And so we are grateful to have Mary Jo Kreitzer here tonight. She heads up the Bakken Center at the University of Minnesota. She has a PhD, master's in nursing and bachelor's in nursing, has written 150 articles, I believe, gives many speeches, and is really a tremendous resource. So without further ado, I will hand it off to Mary Jo. Let's give her a hand.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, and I have to say it really is an honor and pleasure to be with you tonight. It's kind of a gray night, and it's raining and drizzling, and Jim said, I don't even know how many people are going to come out tonight. So really appreciate very much you being here. So my topic tonight is cultivating well-being in our lives and in our communities. And I want to start out with what might seem like a little bit of a somber tone. We are living in a time of such enormous turbulence, and that turbulence is also matched by uncertainty. So as you look at this image on the screen, I imagine that you, like me, some days you feel like you are being drawn down a wild stream. Other days you might feel like you're swirling around rocks, and other days you might feel like you're in a fog. These are really challenging times. And, people get tired of the word unprecedented, but in many ways, the confluence of what we're experiencing at this time really is unprecedented. First of all, we experienced the global 19 pandemic, and that actually didn't just happen. That continues to occur in serial waves. Then we also, have experienced, and I think even more so in this community, the Twin Cities, than other places around the country, growing consciousness of systemic racism with the murder of George Floyd. And that was happening at the same time that we were in the COVID pandemic. That was certainly a huge event in the Twin Cities that caused a lot of anguish and pain and disruption. We also have deeply divisive politics, not only in the United States, but also abroad. And I think, we'd probably all agree that it's a time of enormous global uncertainty. Even, when you think of things like the wars that are going on, the global change, the climate change, and the global impacts of that. So given that context, I can't think of a more important time to be investing in your own well-being and really paying attention to what well-being is and how it shows up in your life and what you can do to foster more well-being. And that's really what I'm going to talk about tonight. And I hope that tonight for you can be a really personal experience. And so as I talk about well-being, you might want to think about well-being in your family, in your neighborhood, maybe in an organization that you're connected with. But I really encourage you to take it down to a really personal level, well-being in your own life. So what we know about well-being is that 80 to 90% of how healthy people are has nothing to do with the healthcare system. That sometimes really shocks people. But in fact, it's really true. The social, the environmental, and the behavioral factors drive a lot of how healthy we are and how much well-being that we have in our lives. 80 to 90% are things outside the healthcare system. So for many years, you heard people talk about we need to shift from a focus on sickness to health, from disease to wellness. But I'd have to say, over the last 5 to 10 years, you've been hearing much more of a focus on this whole concept of well-being. And what I'm here to talk with you tonight about is that well-being is so much more than just health. Health is really only one determinant of well-being. So if we went around the room, if we were sitting in a circle and I asked you to define what well-being is like for you and how it shows up and how you would describe well-being, there's probably a lot of adjectives that would float around. People might describe people having well-being as happy, healthy, or prosperous, or being in a state of balance or alignment, content, peaceful, connected to purpose. People that are experiencing harmony, safe. In one word, well-being is about being whole. One of my favorite definitions of well-being comes from the physician Atul Gawande, who's written a number of wonderful books, Being Mortal, one of the ones in the last 5 years or so. And he defines well-being as being the very reason that we want to be alive. Now, some of you heard Richard Leiter talk, and remember the provocative question that Richard always asks, what gets you up in the morning? And so not too dissimilar to the question of what is the reason that you want to be alive? You know, what is it that is fueling your sense of meaning and purpose in life? So I'm going to be asking you to think about what impacts your well-being. And the Bakken Center has a well-being model, and we actually, went deep down into the research and literature about a decade ago to say, what are those factors that really are tied to well-being? And there are 6 factors I'm going to talk about, one being health. And so how healthy you are is connected to well-being. So is purpose. And I'm sure you can think of people that you know that have really great health, but they don't have much well-being in their life. And you probably can think of people that have really compromised health, but they exude well-being in their life. And sometimes it's because they have a life filled with purpose, or they have rich relationships in their life, or they're in a community that nurtures and sustains them, or they're feeling a deep sense of security. And then the 6th area that I'll talk about tonight is the whole area of the environment, because we know that the environment in which we are living also impacts our well-being. And you can think of environment at many different levels, in many different ways. So well-being is a real whole person perspective. And it's all about increasing people's capacity and their potential. Finding the conditions under which people can thrive and people can flourish. And so I think in many ways, sometimes people that are older, sometimes people that have chronic conditions, they don't identify with the wellness movement because it's like, I'm never going to be able to kind of be there or do that. But if you really start exploring with them this concept of well-being, that truly is, I think, something that is a deep draw for all of us. It's very, very universal. So we have at the Bakken Center a website. It's not our center website where we have all kinds of information. It's a website specifically about taking charge of your health and well-being. And on this website, there's nothing being sold, and you don't need a password, and we don't save any data. I always like to tell people that. We get 250,000 unique visitors a month on this website from all around the world. And you can go on the website and you can actually do a deeper dive into well-being. You can look at any one of these 6 areas. You can also look at sections on managing health conditions and looking at integrative therapies and healing practices, whole person kinds of therapies. So that's just a resource to know about. So let me take a deeper dive into each one of these 6 areas. So the first area I want to talk about is health. And when I think of health, I don't think of only physical health. I think of emotional health, mental health, and spiritual health. All of those aspects of health affect our well-being. There's very compelling evidence that what we eat, how much we move, how well we sleep, and how we manage stress and emotions has a huge impact on our well-being. So the whole concept of thinking about what can we be responsible for? You know, in some respects, decisions that we make can really contribute enormously to our health. So at the bottom of the slide it says, in some respects, health is in our hands. I'm going to go into a little deeper with some of these areas. Food and health, food and nutrition is huge. The Bakken Center, we teach many courses on food as medicine and the whole connection between food and lifestyle. 4 of the top leading causes of death are chronic diseases that have very well established links to diet: coronary artery disease, diabetes, stroke, and cancer. So what we eat makes a huge difference. One of my favorite books on healthy eating is a book written by Michael Pollan. He's not a physician, a nurse, a dietitian. He actually is a New York Times journalist. And he wrote this book in defense of food. And he talks about 3 food rules. And I love these rules. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Now you might think, well, this is kind of ridiculous, eat food. But what he's talking about is eating real food, not chemically processed food. When we go to the grocery store, all the stuff that's in the center of the grocery store tends to be more a product, it's a commercial product rather than a product of nature. And so he's talking about getting back to eating healthy, whole, nutritious kind of food, not too much. So in the United States, we have an issue of people that overeat and are undernourished. And so the whole concept of knowing that it takes time for the message in your stomach to get to your head that you're full. So stop eating, when we are about 80% full is the trick to not overeat. And mostly plants. There's lots of evidence that a plant-forward diet has many health benefits. And so in this book, he doesn't write about everybody has to be vegan or everybody has to be vegetarian. And people can certainly argue with health benefits, environmental benefits of those kinds of food patterns. But these are 3 very simple rules. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. A few other things that are deeper points. His point was eat food versus edible food-like substances, avoid food that's been processed so much. And then I talked about quality and quantity. Shop the peripheries of the supermarket, stay out of the middle, and whenever you can, get outside the supermarket. So eating and emotions, I think, is something else that I just want to raise. A lot of eating is tied to emotions. And so this is a question to ask yourself. Do you eat to relieve stress? Do you eat because of boredom, unhappiness, or is there another emotion? And there's a great book that came out many years ago, and you only need to see the title of the book to kind of get an idea of what it's about. Life is hard and food is easy. And the whole point of it being, if we get in touch with why we're eating and sometimes the emotion behind we're eating, that really can help us develop a much healthier eating pattern and be eating more mindfully. One of the things that I think is kind of fun to do, and we do this in some of the classes we teach, is we encourage people to explore their own food story. So think about this for just a minute. When you were growing up, what role did food play in your life? Do you have memories of preparing food? Were there rituals associated with food or traditions? Who spent time in the kitchen when you were growing up? Did you have struggles with food? Was food used as a reward? Was food used as a punishment? So a lot of our attitudes about food come from our food story when we were growing up. Was there a sense of scarcity? So I had to eat everything I could because there might not be enough. So think about what your food story was. Think about what your food story is now. And then think about what you want your food story to be in the future. So again, this is kind of another strategy to become more mindful. Exercise and fitness I could talk a lot about, but I'm going to only say a few things. This won't surprise you. We live in a very sedentary society, and the risks of inactivity are enormous. There's a whole long list of why it's important to exercise. It decreases our risk of many kinds of diseases. It improves our physical, mental, and social well-being. We sleep better. We live longer. We can enjoy leisure activities more. It helps us avoid injury and maintain a healthy weight. So there's lots of reasons why we should be increasing our physical activity. So even seniors, what are important exercise and fitness guidelines? 30 minutes of exercise most days of the week. And so often the rule is like 5 days, if not 7 days of the week. To obtain even greater benefits, engage in more vigorous activity for a longer duration. And what really works best is to have a balance of cardiovascular conditioning. So that could be fast walking, it could be riding a bike, doing some stretching, doing some strength training, and some balance. And that balance piece, again, gets even more important, as we get older, because balance decreases. I look ridiculous, but I just ordered one of those balance things that you stand on, and I have to put it in front of my standing desk because I can't always stand on it alone because my balance has become more precarious. But I'm committing to do it 5 minutes twice a day, to be standing on that balance board and working on my balance. Find something that you enjoy doing and that you're committed to doing. That's what's most important. So sometimes people say to me, what's best? My answer is whatever it is you'll do. That is what is best. Vary your routine, and if you can, find somebody to do something with you. We know there's lots of benefits of monitoring your exercise, because if you monitor your exercise, it gives you immediate feedback. And so a lot of evidence, for example, if you walk 10,000 steps a day, that's associated with healthier outcomes. So then the next area that I want to talk about that fits under health is stress and stress mastery. And again, that's a topic that I could say so much about. We know there's irrefutable science that there is a mind-body connection. And, it used to be 15, 20 years ago, people would say, oh, well, maybe it's just all in their head. Well, if it's in their head, it's throughout the rest of the body, because the mind-body connection is very real. There's a whole field called psychoneuroimmunology. Our minds, our thoughts are directly connected to the neurological and the immune system. We know that stress adversely impacts every cell of the human body. And acute stress is not the issue as much as chronic stress that literally causes wear and tear. So it used to be that when we wanted to measure stress, we would actually have people take just a test and like how much stress are you experiencing, blah, blah, blah. Now we can measure stress in lots of physiological ways. One of the ways that we can measure stress is by actually looking at people's genes. And so genes being genetic. And so a woman who got the Nobel Prize a number of years ago, Elizabeth Blackburn, found that mothers who cared for children that had very significant disabilities had a decade of premature aging. And they could measure that by looking at the telomeres on the genes. So what the good news is, there's also evidence that if you manage your stress, you can really improve, health in your body in a whole variety of ways. I think I have a slide here that talks about, meditation as one practice. And so we know that when people meditate or when people have positive emotions, it literally changes the structure and the function of the brain. That's what neuroplasticity is. Used to be we thought people age and their brains deteriorate. That's just how life is. We now know that our thoughts, our activities, a positive mood state, practices like meditation can strengthen the brain, literally change the structure and function. So many ways to look at stress mastery, and many kinds of practices and techniques that you can consider. My encouragement to you is to identify the sources of stress in your life, become aware of where you hold your stress, and then learn ways to begin to manage stress. So all of us experience that in a different way, and there's many different kinds of things. Meditation practices, breath practices, imagery, body work. I saw you have a beautiful labyrinth. Walking the labyrinth can be a wonderful way to reduce stress. Social support. I was talking to somebody before that it's fantastic to have services on Zoom, but it's a very different experience when you come in community and you're together. And so, having social support is a really good way to also reduce stress. Emotions have a big impact on our health, and there's real evidence that when we're angry, when we're cynical, that adversely impacts our health. Hopelessness is connected to mortality. On the other hand, positive mood states, positive psychological states can improve our health. When we have negative attitudes and anger and an inability to forgive, who do we hurt the most? Ourselves, right? So I think sometimes we think mentally we're going to have an effect on that other person. Real evidence that the biggest effect is on ourselves. Sleep, I'll just say a few things. Having healthy sleep is a vital component of a flourishing life. What we know is that good sleep can help decrease stress, improve our mood, enhance our concentration and memory. It can lower blood pressure and help people manage a healthy weight, as well as reduce the impact of chronic disease. And so just a few sleep tips. Honor your body's need to sleep. And so, sometimes I think we burn the candle too much at both ends. And when your body is sleepy, that is actually the best time to sleep. When you can, stay awake during the day. Create a good sleep routine, and then avoid stimulants later in the day. So that's more time than I'm going to spend on some of these other areas, but health is a real big one, and especially as we age, focusing on, not only information and advice and counsel we get from our healthcare providers, but what are those things that we do for ourselves. I love talking about purpose, and I'm sure that many of you heard Richard when he came and talked on purpose, and I actually just saw Richard about 2 hours ago. And I was talking about how his work on purpose, I actually was exposed to that work even before we developed the well-being model, but there's so much research now emerging. Purpose is so connected to our vitality. Purpose is, Richard would say, that is what gets us up in the morning. What is your aim? What's your direction? It's very different than a job or career. While some people live out their purpose in a job or career, purpose is something bigger and beyond that. So there's many questions, I think, to ponder, and I think these are ageless questions. It's, as Richard talks about, we don't figure out purpose once in our life. We revisit purpose about at least every decade of our life. And so the perennial questions of who am I, where do I belong, what do I care about, what's my purpose in life, are ageless questions that we should be continuing to explore as we continue to reinvent ourselves. He wrote the book, The Power of Purpose, and he interviewed people over the age of 65, and he asked them one question: if you had your life to do over, what would you do differently? And he was astonished at the answer to that. What they said is that they would be more reflective, more courageous, and they would be clear earlier about purpose in their life. There really is evidence that purpose is connected to longevity. This is a study that was funded by the National Institutes of Aging. It was a study of 6,000 people. And what the researchers found was that people who had a greater sense of purpose and direction were more likely to outlive their peers. And then look at this next statistic. People with a sense of purpose had a 15% lower risk of death compared to those who said they were aimless. Think how much we would be applauding a drug if it was 15% better. This is about finding purpose. And so, I think this is such a compelling, I think, topic for us to be, pondering. I think during COVID, many people reevaluated purpose and began to ask questions of what is important now. Because I think for many people, things shifted during COVID in terms of what was really important. What holds meaning? And it was a time for many people of rethinking priorities. And now I think as we move into a different phase of COVID, it's again a time of real reflection on that whole area of purpose. So, Richard talks about, and we have this information on our website, when you're pondering your purpose, think about your gifts, your passions, your values, what the needs are in the world, and how you can distill that into a sense of purpose. So health and purpose are important. The third thing I want to talk about are relationships. Relationships are so core to well-being. The health risks of being alone are comparable in magnitude to the risks associated with cigarette smoking, high blood pressure, and obesity. We know there's a lot of depression in the United States. There's even more loneliness than there is depression. So just think about that, a lot of loneliness. And so while in some respects people might have more friends than ever on social media, they feel more isolated and alone. And this is actually, it's very interesting. This is not only seniors that experience this. So throughout adult life, even teenagers, college students, surveys have been done of college students, feel a deep sense of aloneness and isolation. We know that 47% of Americans report that they feel alone, left out, and lacking in meaningful connections with others. True for all ages. And with more social media, we say we're more connected than ever, but we're more lonely. And so I ask you to think about, as you think about well-being in your own life, are there people that you are very close to in terms of family and friends? So when you're happy, when you're sad, when you have good news, when you have troubling news, do you have people that you can turn to? And are your relationships balanced in terms of giving and receiving? So oftentimes women, many times people that are in helping professions, whether it's teaching or healthcare, social work, have an orientation of giving, giving, giving until what? They're depleted. And so this whole question of are your relationships balanced? So you might have a lot of people in your life you're taking care of and that you're serving and that you're delivering meals to and that you're doing all kinds of things. Who is nurturing you? That's the question I'm encouraging you to think about tonight in terms of your own relationships. So some things that are important, share your feelings. And so what do I mean by share your feelings? A lot of us grew up in a time when we kept everything bottled up inside. And we just really didn't feel maybe even the safety. During the pandemic, I talked a lot with health professionals about the emotion of anger. And I said, think of holding a beach ball underwater and how hard that is to hold a beach ball underwater. Think of trying to hold 2 beach balls underwater, or 3. What happens when you're trying to hold those beach balls? It's going to bubble up. Something's going to spurt out unexpectedly, and that is what happens when we suppress emotions. And so the important thing with emotions, whether it's anger, whether it's grief, or other kinds of emotions, are finding ways to express them and working through emotions. Other things important to relationships: listen deeply, avoid assumptions, build trust, allow yourself to be vulnerable. Brené Brown has written a beautiful, beautiful book on vulnerability. And we used to think, I think sometimes as a society, being vulnerable was bad, like the sign of weakness, like, no, you would not want to be vulnerable. And now I think there's a recognition that it's only when we're vulnerable that we actually develop true, authentic relationships. It's in my vulnerability when I really share who I am and what I'm feeling that I can make a deep connection with another human being. So vulnerability is really a strength. And then learn ways to manage conflict. So I've talked about health, purpose, relationships. The next area I want to talk about is community. And there's lots of ways to look at community. You can look at the qualities of a healthy community. And so we're in Wayzata. So think about Wayzata as a community. So there are probably characteristics that you can think of that make Wayzata a very livable community, with roads and bridges and assets and resources. Is there equity in the community? So equity, do people have equal access to resources? Is there fairness? Is there a feeling of connectedness in the community? So you might have a lot of resources and assets, but if people can't access them, or if they don't feel connected to them, they don't benefit from them. So livability are things like economic, social, cultural, political, technological infrastructure, roads and bridges, equity, access, fairness, diversity. The next slide talks about that connectedness. And I think there's two ways that are interesting to look at a community when you think of all the assets. Are people engaged, and so do they participate? And then the second level is, do people feel empowered to solve problems, to move to action? And the example on the slide I have comes from Whidbey Island. And so many of you, I'm sure, have been to Whidbey Island off the coast of Seattle. You get in a ferry to take you to Whidbey Island. Beautiful ferry ride over there. A group of women became really concerned about who feeds homeless teenagers on weekends. And I think a lot of people would have thought, Whidbey Island, there's not homeless teenagers, but they became really concerned. They knew there were homeless teens, and on weekends they didn't have access to food. They created this initiative, Whidbey Island Nourishes, so without any means testing or ideological testing, kids had access to healthy, nutritious food. What do you think they discovered? They discovered a much bigger problem than they recognized. And it's actually a really powerful example of people solving problems themselves in the community, that it doesn't always take a city to solve a problem, or, an act of legislation, which these days is kind of tough to get. Another way to look at community, are, other characteristics of the community, and this comes from the work of Ed Diner. And honestly, in these days, this isn't new. This study was like in 2015. But the discovery of what creates the highest level of well-being in a community is a strong rule of law, low rates of corruption, efficient and effective government, progressive taxation, income security programs, political freedoms, and a healthy natural environment. So again, I think this is a good litmus test for us to be putting up the communities that we're living. To what extent, do they have these characteristics? There's evidence that people living in American cities with low well-being are twice as likely to have a heart attack as those that are living in a city with high well-being. So even though what we personally do in our lives is so important, the community around us is also critical. Security is another aspect of well-being, and I have to honestly say to you, I think security has become such a greater issue in the last few years. Feeling safe and secure is a very basic human need, and there's lots of ways to look at security. You can look at financial security, you can look at food security, you can look at housing security. You can look at safety and security from, like, do people take simple preventative, health measures. You can also look at security from the aspect of violence. If people live in fear of violence for any reason, that erodes their sense of security, that erodes their well-being. So when you think of well-being in this way, you recognize that if people have health and purpose and they have good relationships, but if they're insecure, if they live in fear, that's going to have a very corrosive impact on well-being. So I just have to tell you, the next 3 slides I'm showing you, I actually created these slides, the next 3, probably 5 years ago. And I'm telling you that because this is not intended to be a political statement, but these are really reflective of the times that we're living in. Assaults to human rights pose a threat to human dignity, livelihoods, and safety. Racism, intolerance, the lack of civility have a deeply corrosive effect on the social fabric that binds us together. And again, I created this slide a long time ago, asking people rhetorically the question, do people trust their neighbors, their police, and politicians? Now, this is almost an inflammatory question to even have on this slide. And I didn't take it out because I've had this in my slides for a long time. But this is such a bigger issue today because of people's lived experience where they don't trust their neighbors. And I just think even in this last week, the fact that there have been, 3 shootings in 3 different cities in America, young people who were doing everyday things in life, getting in the wrong car, driving down the wrong road, and knocking on a door, and they were shot. So security really impacts our well-being so significantly. And I think the point that I want to make is not to leave this in like a down note in terms of like we're living in such an insecure place. Think about what you can do. Make safe choices, focus on what you can control, face fear and anxiety. But the last piece, rethink money, but the last piece is protect others. When everyone is secure, we all benefit. When we work toward a more just and a more equitable society, that gives everybody a greater sense of security. Security is very interdependent with equity. And so, if we want to think about what are sort of ways to be reducing violence, I'm sure we could come up with a very long list of things that we could do in our communities to reduce violence. But creating safety and security for all is one important measure to be considering. So the last area of well-being that I want to highlight is the whole area of the environment. And this is actually such an interesting one to think about. And you might think about environment and think clean air, clean water, not having toxins in the environment. But the built environment is also very connected to well-being. And just like in healthcare, we talk about evidence-based practice, there's evidence-based design. So how we design our cities, our homes, our churches, our places of worship, how we design parks are very connected to well-being. Lots of research emerging on the importance of nature and access to nature, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. And then there's the whole topic of planetary well-being. And we know that what's happening in the climate affects all of our areas of well-being. So the first area I'll talk a little bit more in deeper detail is the whole area of nature. And this is so interesting to me because Mary Meyer is here from the Arboretum. I'm sure many of you know Mary. And I think it was 10, 15 years ago that the Bakken Center started collaborating with the Arboretum to offer courses on nature and healing. And Dr. Jeannie Larson, who's half-time at the Arboretum and half-time at the Bakken Center, now teaches about 5 courses on looking at the connection between nature and well-being. But when Jeannie started doing that, and I don't know, Mary, was that like 10, 12 years ago, maybe even longer ago, maybe 15. Nobody else in the country was teaching academic courses or community-based courses now. Now the NIH is talking about nature and nature prescriptions and spending time in nature and well-being. So this particular book, Nature Heals, was written by Richard Louv, who the Arboretum has hosted a couple of times. And the first book that he wrote about kids and kids being so cut off from nature, and he coined the term nature deficit disorder. And he said, it's almost like a medical diagnosis. We have kids that literally are so overprogrammed that they don't spend time in nature, and it affects their learning, their creativity, their ability to build relationships. We really have to rethink our overprogramming of kids and find ways to have them spend time in nature. Then he wrote this next book, the nature principle, and it's all about adults. And he said, guess what? The same thing I was writing about with kids' nature deficit disorder, same thing is happening with us as adults. And so what do we know about nature contact and human health? Humans are increasingly disconnected from nature. Over half the world's population and 4 out of 5 Americans live in urban areas where access to nature may be very limited. We spend 90% of our time indoors, most of that in buildings. And then look at this statistic on media consumption, and this is all kinds of media. For US adults in 2016, 10 hours and 39 minutes daily. Daily. I heard somebody say daily? Daily. And that's all forms of media. So it's not just watching TV, but it's phone, it's computer, it's kind of all forms. The evidence of benefits of nature are so huge. And this is, I mean, it is so exciting. There are literally randomized control clinical trials now that are done that look at when people spend time in nature, it heals. It can help reduce stress, improve sleep, decrease anxiety and depression, lead to greater happiness and life satisfaction. It can reduce aggression. There's evidence that in cities where there's green spaces and parks, that can reduce aggression and violence. It was many years ago, it was probably 10 years ago, I was invited to Korea to give a talk, and it was a talk on well-being. And it was so interesting because this conference was sponsored by the Ministry of Forests and the Ministry of Health. And in Korea, it's like 80% forested. And they were talking about the types of trees they were planting and the terpenes in the trees, almost like aromatherapy, and the health benefits chemically of like what we're smelling from nature. So the science emerging on nature, health, and healing, has been truly just breathtaking. So I have just 2 slides to talk about the impact of climate change on human health. And so oftentimes I think people, when they think of climate change, they think of violent weather. And certainly we've been able to start seeing changes in Minnesota already because of climate change. And it makes my soul weep when I read about the fact that we may lose our loons in Minnesota. We might lose moose in Minnesota. So many of the types of both animals and vegetation that we've had in Minnesota may need to migrate further north because of the effects of climate change. So I think we often think of weather. But if you look at this slide, the effects are air pollution, changes in vector, increasing allergens, water impacts. Look at all the water fights that are happening right now in the western states over who gets how much water from the Colorado River. Water quality impacts, water and food supply, environmental degradation, and as well as extreme heat and severe weather. Already, there are people around the world that are having to migrate to live in different places because they are losing their land. And so I think when we think of the effects of climate change, it's helpful to think about how, in many ways, climate change has the risk of eroding all aspects of well-being that I've talked about: our health, our purpose, our relationships, community, our security, as well as, obviously, the environment. And the next slide, talks about, what are some of the things that we can personally do in our lives. Everything from the kind of cars that we drive to, whether we use, other forms of transportation, recycling, all of those other kinds of things that we can do to have an impact on the climate. A sobering statistic, and I think we as seniors should be really taking this very seriously. Today's young adults may be the first generation in modern history to be less healthy than their parents. It's true. So I hope that this has given you some food for thought, and I hope that you're reflecting a little bit on what are your strengths and what are your challenges. And as you've heard me talk about well-being tonight, are there any surprises, in what you've heard? We did bring along some resources, and I think that Virginia passed out for many of you that website information of taking charge of your health and well-being. And I also brought along several practices. And so I sometimes think it's really nice to learn and have some simple practices at our fingertips that we can do. And so the three of them that I brought tonight. One is breathe to relax. And sometimes this is called the 4-7-8 breath practice. And this practice actually is very simple to do. And so what you do is you breathe in to the count of 4, you hold your breath to the count of 7, and then you breathe out to the count of 8. And you do that 3 or 4 times. And there's evidence that when you do that, it really does help reset your physiological, system in terms of, feeling stress. And so, if you're maybe before going in for a medical appointment, before having a difficult conversation with somebody, just think about, you could do slow, deep breathing. That actually also can help very much reduce stress. But this 4-7-8 breath practice is another one that's very simple. Breathe in to the count of 4, hold to the count of 7, and then breathe out to the count of 8. The next practice that I brought it says mindful moment, and it says the stop practice. And I want to just say a few things about mindfulness. I don't know if you've ever had a speaker, come on mindfulness, and you've probably heard of mindfulness. Maybe you've heard of mindfulness meditation. The simplest thing I can tell you is that mindfulness is being in the present moment. That's really what mindfulness is a way of life. It's not just a meditation practice. And you might think, well, being in the present moment, what do I mean by that? Well, you're physically sitting in these seats, but where are you in your head? We spend a lot of our time on autopilot, thinking about the past or thinking about the future. What are we going to do when we get home? What are we going to do tomorrow? What are we going to do next week? And so cultivating the capacity to be in the present moment is actually a really challenging thing to do. How many of you have ever driven someplace but you don't remember driving there, but you arrived? Okay, I'm seeing people. How about eating a meal but you don't remember tasting the food? And that's because we spend a lot of our time on autopilot. So what mindfulness teaches is to often use the breath, and there's other practices as well, to actually bring yourself, to be in the present moment. And this particular practice, called the stop practice, helps you when you're in a tense or, conflictual situation. And so I'm just looking at Mary Johnson, who used to teach us at the Bakken Center. And Mary and I never had a conflict, but just say we actually had a conflict. And we were sitting in a room, and Mary said something that made me really uncomfortable, or maybe it embarrassed me, or maybe she said something that made me really angry. Now, Mary would never do those things, but I'm just using that as an example. But if that happened, if I'm on autopilot, I might respond in a pretty angry and aggressive way. So what mindfulness teaches is to notice how you're feeling in the moment. Because if I notice, whoa, when Mary said that, I feel like my heart's racing, my breathing, I'm feeling flushed. The moment of noticing is the moment of waking up. So when you notice how you are feeling, then you can choose your response. I can't tell you how huge that is. That helps people become less reactive. The moment of noticing is the moment of waking up, because then I can think, do I really want to respond to Mary when I'm feeling so angry, or am I going to wait? And maybe I'll ask her tomorrow, or maybe I'll call her up tomorrow and sort of explore. Mindfulness in the workplace is huge. We actually teach a course, Mindfulness in the Workplace, and we've had now thousands of people go through this course because there's so much of a capacity for things to escalate. And so what mindfulness at work is about is developing mindful communication and ways to de-escalate. So the stop practice, very simply, is slow down, take a breath, observe what's happening in the moment, observe how you're feeling, and then decide how you want to proceed. So stop. And so, try it. I mean, next time you're in a stressful situation and you notice it's a stressful situation, sometimes we don't notice it, and then we react even before we notice it. So if you notice it, just think about going through this acronym of the STOP practice. And then the last one that I brought is a gratitude card. And this is, I've actually done some research on gratitude, and I've published a couple papers on gratitude. And there really is evidence that if we live a life where we are grateful, and if we cultivate gratitude in our life, it can actually really enhance our well-being, and it can reduce our stress, and it can increase our sense of connectedness. And there's a very simple practice of gratitude called 3 good things. And the practice goes this way. When you get up in the morning, or maybe when you go to bed at night, think of 3 things that you're grateful for. And if you can, write those down. And then once a week, go back and look at what you've written down and just notice the patterns that are showing up in your life. And there's evidence that if people do a practice like this, even for 21 days, it sometimes takes 21 days to kind of establish a habit, that can actually really be enhancing their sense of well-being. So this is connected to something I talked about earlier, which was positivity and positive mood states. And the fact that when we have positive mood states, it literally changes the structure and the function of our brain. So I think, from a Christian point of view, based on faith tradition in this particular church, there would be a lot of reasons to be able to talk about why living a life of gratitude, is the moral thing and the ethical thing to do. But I'm here tonight to tell you there are also enormous health benefits of gratitude. The last, and I didn't bring you a card on it, but the last practice that I just want to lift up tonight is the whole practice of kindness. And again, there's really interesting research on kindness. The company Google, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with Google, a number of years ago did a big project, and they called it the Aristotle Project. And they pulled together, they put tens of millions of dollars in this study, and they pulled together researchers of every stripe. They had anthropologists and sociologists and behavioral scientists and health professionals and statisticians. And the one question they had is, what makes the most effective team? Google needs teams to do their work. And what they had all kinds of questions. Is it getting smartest people? Is it getting people that are just high in emotional intelligence? Is it introverts? Is it extroverts? What is it that makes the best possible team? And there's 2 things that emerged from the study. One was that teams did really well when they weren't overly managed and supervised. That doesn't surprise me. But the primary finding was the best teams were the teams where there was kindness and where people treated each other in a kind way. Those were the teams that were most effective. So it wasn't being the smartest, having the highest intelligence, sort of any of those other things. It was that whole quality of kindness. So with that, I think I'm going to close, and I'm happy to have conversation with you or answer any questions that you might have, either about my presentation and well-being tonight, or anything you might want to know about the Bakken Center. The Earl E. Bakken Center at the Center for Spirituality and Healing at the University of Minnesota, we're approaching our 30-year birthday. I can't believe that we started almost 3 decades ago. So, questions that anybody might have. And we do have mics that you'll walk around.
And is this on, Joel? Yeah, great. Well, first I want to thank you so much for that presentation. Lots to think about. I love those cards. I'm going to take them home.
Good. Thank you.
But as a thank you, we'd like to give you this leather portfolio that
thank you
has the
very
Next Chapter
much.
logo on it, Wayzata Community Church.
Beautiful.
So you remember us as we remember you.
Well, thank you very much for that. I appreciate that.
So again, I'll wander around with the mic, and raise your
Okay, back there.
Thank you so much for all the great information. I'm curious how affiliated you are with any healthcare systems and the work you're doing, and do you see a path for wellness to be incorporated into our current health systems more?
Oh, that's such a good question. I'll just repeat the question. Oh, gosh. The question is healthcare systems. How much work do I do with healthcare systems? And do I think there's much hope or potential for our healthcare systems to get a focus that's more on health? You know, I would have been more optimistic in answering your question, to be truly honest with you, 10 years ago than I am today. I, have my PhD in public health, and I have been a nurse, for a long time, and I've worked in healthcare systems for a long time. And we have the best healthcare system in the world if you have an infectious disease or if you need a transplant. And we have incredibly dedicated health professionals. But our healthcare systems, in many respects, are fragmented and in shambles. And if any of you have had a loved one that is hospitalized, and I talk a lot to groups of, like you all, saying, have an advocate, have a family member. You need to have somebody with you that is listening, a second set of ears, that is taking notes, because we don't have a system. We have actually a series of episodes you can have in healthcare. There are rare exceptions to some health systems that actually really get it right and do it right. We've had a sick care system in this country. And even though the names of some of these hospital systems have changed, and I have to say it with a little irony that they put health after their name, so instead of being, I won't name any of them, but the name of the system, like medical center, they've added the word health. But they haven't necessarily developed an orientation, that focuses on health. Right now we are in a really serious state within our, within healthcare for so many reasons. One of which, there's so much burnout and stress in the health professions. Before the pandemic, in some specialties of even physicians, burnout rates were 50% or above. And that was true for nurses as well. Post-pandemic, it is so serious. Some specialties, it's upwards of 80%. Very high percents of health professionals are not only leaving their jobs, they're leaving their careers. And so I'm worried about that as a senior. I think we should all be worried about that. Who is going to be out there caring for us? And so I think it's a really, really critical time that we, as community members, be asking very hard questions about our healthcare systems and demanding the kind of healthcare that we believe is important to have. And it's probably also why I personally feel it's so important that we take charge of our own health and well-being. And that's not saying that if I had a diagnosis of cancer or a serious disease, I would be the first person to be lining up at the healthcare system, and I would avail myself of all the conventional evidence-based care I had. So this is not rejecting that, but it's just recognizing that our systems are in a very fragile state. So I wish I could be more optimistic. I mean, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and I've worked with health systems across the country. Just finished working with a big health system in California that I actually think is doing quite a good job. Worked with a lot of the Boston health systems. 10 years ago, I was doing a lot of work on how do we transform healthcare delivery by bringing in more whole person care, culture, spirituality, integrative therapies, and healing practices. And there are pockets, where that has happened. But honestly, that's not enough if the bread and butter's not there. I mean, if you don't even have continuity of a provider and continuity of information, there's no amount of aromatherapy or massage that's going to mitigate the other serious impacts. So I hope I haven't offended anybody by answering that question, but I think our healthcare systems are in very rough shape. Yeah, I mean, is that what you feel?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mary Jo. I was going to ask the same question, but I have another question too. You were making a comment about some ladies who were going over to that island off of Seattle.
Whidbey Island, yeah.
Yes, and they were going to bring food to these young people.
Yeah, they actually, on Whidbey Island, it was a group of women who became
Right.
concerned about feeding the teenagers. So it was the women on the island. They weren't bringing the food to the kids. It was the people on Whidbey Island accessing the food and making it available
I see.
versus a government program.
So it seemed to me that that sort of brought to mind that in order to evaluate how we can possibly move our healthcare system into a better, more whole person kind of perspective, we need to have the kind of research that you've been talking about, and even more and more of that kind of thing.
Yep.
Do you think that that will suffice in eventually changing the system?
Well, Mary, I think it's one piece of it. I mean, you know, in healthcare, we have to decide if healthcare is a privilege or a right in this country. And that's a very, very basic policy issue. And if we feel like it's a privilege and that there's some people that just don't deserve healthcare, there's some states in the country, Minnesota is a North Star, you know, much better state than many other states, but there's many states that, you know, have tried to eliminate or have as minimal a Medicaid program as possible. And so, I mean, that's a huge policy decision as a country or states we need to make. Do we believe that health care is just a privilege or a right? And if we believe it's a right, are there minimum benefit sets that people should have? And that so that there's equity in what they have access to. And then, you know, you are a nurse, you know that there are so many things we have to do within the healthcare system itself, policy issues aside, how we staff nurses, how we schedule nurses. I say to hospital administrators all the time, it's really hard to say you're patient-centered, relationship-based, if the patient never sees the same nurse twice, right? And so if any of you have been in the hospital, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you don't have any continuity in the providers you see, it's very hard to feel like anybody knows your story. So I'm not going to get into it, but I've written a couple books on what's called integrative nursing, and that is a different way of practicing nursing, and it's very person-centered, relationship-based, whole person, you know, leverages, you know, all that we can access from conventional care, but also integrative therapies, and focuses on the self-care, the well-being of the caregiver. Because I feel like that's a critical piece.
Yes, I was just curious if you know Ruth Bachman and have done any work with her, because she focuses on spirituality and cancer at the university.
Oh yes, Ruth Bachman is a very special friend to the center. And we've done a number of things with Ruth Bachman. She's written a beautiful book, Going Through the Narrow Spots of Life. And so, you know, I think Ruth is somebody who, you know, to me exemplifies so much somebody finding purpose in her life. So she had a diagnosis of cancer. She, you know, had an amputation, so she lost, you know, part of her arm. And she looked at, you know, how could she turn her life into a life of service, you know, and giving back? And what do we learn when we go through those, what she calls the narrow spots of life? So yeah, Ruth Bachman's work is beautiful.
I can see overlaps with, you know, what you've talked about, and I've heard her speak before too. She might be a good person to speak here too sometime.
Yeah, she would be.
Other questions?
Okay, there's one more down here, Jim.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm a nurse too, have been for a long time. Don't work in the hospitals anymore, just save it all for summer camp. But I'm curious as to the nursing education today. Is this included in nursing 101 for beginning nurses, because I don't remember ever getting anything like this when I started nursing umpteen million years ago.
Yeah.
And how important it should be, especially when, I remember learning that, okay, you got to kind of become desensitized to many things, and you can't form deep relationships with your patients.
Yeah, right.
And I thought that was the wrongest thing I had ever heard. Because how can
You were right.
How can you understand and be an advocate for someone if you don't know where they're coming from, you don't know their story?
Yeah.
So, this whole wellness thing just doesn't seem like it's a nursing practice today. And it's something everybody needs to be a little bit more effective and save yourself. My whole nursing practice, I always heard, do more with less.
Yeah.
And then it would be, oh yes, but take care of yourself. But. So to hear something like this is very uplifting. And it's something that I think I learned in my later years, how important it was to have balance in my life. And sometimes in nursing, you have to run under the radar to do the right thing.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for your service, as a nurse. And I do feel like this is being taught more in nursing schools. And Mary would say that. Mary was at St. Olaf for a long time teaching. And I think, yes, if you look at even like criteria to accredit nursing schools, they very much require that we teach about these concepts and whole person. And now the newest standards that just came out from AACN, which is the sort of a certifying body, they have competencies and they specifically talk about self-care even. I mean, it's like well-being and self-care. They actually also in these new documents do talk about holistic, whole person, and even use the word integrative and mindfulness. So I'm not going to be an outlier for long. I'm mainstream.
Any more questions?
Well, thank you so much for coming out tonight.
So thanks again, Mary Jo, and please help yourself to refreshments. I'm sure there's a lot of them out there, and feel free to take them home. And this tape will be up the next day or two. Joel will take care of that, so anyone that you think would really benefit from this that wasn't